There's no sports car in the world with the lineage and recognition of the Porsche 911. But to most non-car people, a 911 is a 911 is a 911. But there's one model with such a mystique, with such a reputation, that everyone knows this 911. The Turbo. Or to you and me, the Porsche 930. And today on Twin Cam, we're going to explore how and why this ridiculous car came into being, then consider what makes these so special and so iconic. But before we get into the history, I first want to introduce you to this car, because as if having a 930 here wasn't enough of a privilege, this one's a bit of a special one, because this is a 1989 Turbo Targa, which makes it rare, incredibly rare actually, much rarer than you'd think, because it's believed that there are only ever 19 cars like this. The headline act is, of course, that it's a Targa, my favourite of all the 911 body styles, with the open top, the really elegant rollover hoop and the cool curved rear screen. Then, of course, it's a turbo, so it's got the big whale-tailed T-tray spoiler on it. And also, it's a 1989, and that means it gets a 5-speed gearbox. Most 930s only ever had 4 speeds, but just this final year of production had the extra ratio. And that makes this probably the most desirable of the breed. But with that out of the way, let's go back to the early 1970s and see how this story started. Because as with all the great engineering advances, the turbo story begins in racing, and in particular, Can-Am. The Porsche 917 is one of the most famous prototype racers, and for 1972 Stuttgart wanted to enter it in Can-Am, but it was at a serious power disadvantage compared to its competitors. To bridge the gap, their solution was to enter the world of turbocharging and fit a snail to their racing flat 12. Porsche stormed to the 72 and 73 championships, as the 917-30 could produce up to 1500 brake horsepower from its 5.4 litre engine. And this paved the way for Porsche to apply this technology in other racing series. So here come two of my favourite words: homologation special. Porsche wanted to enter smaller cars into sports car racing, so attention was turned to the 911 and Group 4. In order to meet the regulations, 400 turbocharged 911s had to be produced, and the 911 Turbo was first shown to the world at the Paris Auto Show in October 1974. And that was the initial vision. Just to make 400 purely to do a little bit of racing. But these cars were so captivating, so different and so special that the Turbo very quickly became a standard series production car and the undisputed centre of Porsche's performance lineup. They made 18,000. But turbocharging itself was nothing new, and it was a full decade before, in 1962, when the Oldsmobile Jetfire and Chevrolet Corvair Spyder became the first production turbocharged cars. But in the event, this pair were a flash in the pan, and 11 years later, in 1973, BMW bolted a snail to their 2002, bringing turbo technology to European production cars. But still, there wasn't anything concrete. Even the 2002 Turbo only lasted a year, so it took Porsche to make turbocharging truly mainstream. It wouldn't be wrong to say, therefore, that the 930 was the world's first genuinely successful turbocharged car. And nobody at the show in 1974 could ever have foreseen the longevity of what was meant to be a tiny niche in 911 production. But the changes Porsche made to the rest of the car make this so much more than just its turbocharged engine. But before we look at all that, let's see what Porsche's engineers did to the 911's famous flat 6. By this point, even the most basic 911 had a 2687cc engine, but for the turbo that became 2994cc. They then gave it beefier bearings and of course a big KKK turbocharger, feeding 11.5 psi's worth of boost into the inlet. Then supplying it all with fuel was the ubiquitous Bosch K-Jetronic injection. A standard 911 of the era made about 150 brake horsepower, and the Carrera 3-litre RS was throwing out 230. The turbo, in launch spec, made 260 brake horsepower. And that didn't make it the most powerful 911 up to that point, but certainly the most powerful series production model. But for 78, the 3-litre displacement became 3299cc. They added an intercooler, raised the boost to 14.5 psi, and power output went up to a nice round 300 brake horsepower at 5,500 RPM and peak torque of 304 pound-feet at 4,000 revs. Those numbers mean that one of these tiny cars can sprint to 60 in 4.9 seconds and on to a top speed of 162 miles per hour. And that acceleration figure, much the same on the earlier cars, meant that Car and Driver magazine in the US named the 930 as the fastest car of the 1970s. So to the supporting mods. The gearbox was completely different and much stronger than the standard 911s, only featuring the aforementioned 4 speeds, but designed to take the torque of the new power plant. There was also a beefier clutch, stiffer suspension from the Carrera RS, and best of all, drilled brake discs and aluminium calipers, derived from those on the 917, giving the 930 a genuine claim to Le Mans spec brakes. For this 89 car, there are stiffer anti-roll bars and, of course, the Getrag G50 5-speed box. And this component makes a much bigger difference than you'd think, because as in many of the early turbocharged cars, the 930 has lag, and lots of it. The boost only really kicks in at 4,000 RPM, and peak power is at 5.5, so the extra ratio makes it much easier to stay right within the power band, maximising performance. And then there are the visual changes. A 930 is immediately identifiable from a standard 911 of the 70s because all the elegance of the original is gone, replaced by a ludicrously wide body, stretched out by 165mm, to the point where Porsche felt the need to add these paint protection strips on the leading edge of the rear arches. And to fill the arches out, the wheels are 6J at the front and 8J at the rear. Then there's the wing. The 70s was the decade of the whale tail, but for these 3.3-litre cars, that became the T-tray, as the spoiler grew even larger, dominating the style of the car, with a thick rubber surround and providing the airflow for the top-mounted intercooler. There's so much muscle to the 930 that the entire vibe of the styling changes, pulling it a lot closer to the ridiculous excess of the arched and winged Lamborghini Countach. But Porsche managed to integrate the changes into the 911 with an incredible finesse. Compared to the original coupe, the Targa roof, the wide body, the spoiler, and even the impact bumpers suit the car perfectly. The 930 is a lesson for anyone on how to update an old design. By the time the turbo was launched, the 911 was already a 12-year-old car. And while Porsche were always tinkering with their models, making a 75 vastly different to a 63, they still had the same bones beneath. I'd argue that this point had a massive impact on the 930's cultural status, because the 911 wasn't perfect. It was a mechanical relic with its air-cooled rear-mounted flat six that most mainstream manufacturers were abandoning en masse as a layout. Even Porsche themselves tried to kill off the air-cooled pendulum with the 928, but we all know that the 911 is the shape that survives. What consumers were met with then is an immensely powerful engine with a brutal character mounted right out behind the rear wheels. And that gave the 911 the nickname that characterises it, the Widowmaker. When Porsche's engineers set out to make the turbo a reality, they had to deal with the fundamental problems with the layout. Now, back in the 40s and 50s, it wasn't a problem. In fact, it was advantageous for many manufacturers because a rear engine layout gives great packaging and gives very good traction. It's only thanks to the layout, to be fair, that the 911 has 4 seats. But to counteract against the pendulum effect, the 911's original power unit was lightened as much as possible. That's why it was air-cooled, and that's why it was made out of aluminium. But turbocharging introduces more weight, and of course to spin the turbine you need to hook the snail up to the exhaust, which is right at the back of the car. Then to maximise your gains, the compressed air needs cooling to make it dense, so under the wing there's an intercooler. Finally, this is an expensive sports car, so consumers demand luxuries, and that means there's an aircon compressor as well. Altogether, this totals a weight penalty of between 50 and 60 kilograms, and that's all right in the tail of the car. So when you have 300 horsepower on tap and the boost only comes in at 4,000 RPM, it's not a surprise to see why so many amateurs struggle to tame the beast. Now, for all the excess and amazement that were all those modifications, it's allied to a car that, in 1989, is aged. First, the good. Now, you heard the noise when I got into the car. Everything is very, very solidly constructed. I also get a decent amount of equipment, so I have, of course, that 5-speed gearbox. I also have air conditioning. I also have electric windows and a nice stereo, but you can't help but feel that this is a really, really old car for 1989. We've put the roof on because it started raining, and frankly I'd rather not get the interior of this car soaking wet. So you realise that the steering column has no adjustment in it, there's no power steering, and then there's the ventilation. So this car does have the air conditioning, as I've mentioned, and the controls for it are down here on this centre console. So you've got the strength of it and you've also got the fan. But then to control the heater, there's a knob in the centre of the car here that controls the air coming off the exhaust because, of course, it's air-cooled. But then to adjust the direction and to adjust an additional fan, there are controls here hidden behind the steering wheel that you can't see because it's a car from the 60s. And also they're slightly incomprehensible as well. So there's that. You can't quite see all the dials as well. The dials are brilliant because it's a Porsche, so you have the tachometer big in the centre, little boost gauge at the bottom, you have all your oil gauge, of course, for your temperature, your pressure and your level. You have, of course, your speedometer, a clock and your fuel gauge, but you can't quite see them all, especially when you've got your hands on the steering wheel. Again, ergonomics are not a thing that they really knew anything about in the 1960s. And then when you look at it, it's an elegant design, but it's odd. Nothing is quite in the place you'd expect it to be once you start looking. So the switch for the lights is down here, but the switch for the fog lamps are over here in the centre of the car, and they're not centred. They're slightly off to the passenger side of the car because of the instrument cluster. You have little warning lights that are randomly placed on the dash, and the Blaupunkt cassette deck, very cool though it may be, is also way offset to the left. It's a lovely interior, and it's very, very nicely trimmed with this gorgeous cream leather, and everything is very solidly constructed. But it feels old. It feels cobbled together to try and keep the 911 somewhat up to date. It's a ridiculous split personality, but it seems to give it an awful lot of character. Because a lot of the cars from the 1980s are just grey plastic bundles of meh. There's nothing really to them. Whereas with the 911, you've got the cool if a little bit off canter, 4-spoke Porsche steering wheel. You've got this beautifully upholstered leather interior. Everything is so solidly constructed. You have the dials, of course, all that information, and they're a lesson in clarity with the ready orange needles. And then everything is just a bit different. Everything is not quite where you'd expect it to be. You've got to learn the interior of this car, and I think that's actually a good thing for the 911. It feels old, but it feels characterful. For a company with such a sense of evolution over revolution, Porsche has had a serious number of truly iconic cars. But this is the daddy of them all. The 911 as a whole may be the archetypal Porsche, but its status as a cultural icon is only possible thanks to the excess, flamboyance and reputation of the Porsche 930. This car is the antithesis of anything modern because its power delivery is ridiculous and the finish is confusing at best. But these are properties that seriously endear the 930. It's impossible to understate the importance of this car to Porsche and to the 911 because every generation of 911 since has had a turbo at the top of the pile. And on that note, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.